Did Abraham Lincoln predict his death, and what was his problem with women? What caused his crippling depression, and why the heck do so many people think he was gay? These are all questions you will learn answers to today. Abraham Lincoln lived an insane life, and there's a lot more to him than you might learn in school. It's kind of detrimental that more people don't understand what the man went through on his journey to the White House. The 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, aka Honest Abe, the Penny Man, the Great Emancipator, the House Divided, is known as the man who abolished slavery and led the Union through the Civil War. He appears on several forms of currency and over 250 statues worldwide, and he is regarded as one of the greatest presidents and leaders in world history. But he started as a nobody in the middle of nowhere. Big L was born in the frontier woods of Kentucky in February of 1809. Lincoln spent his early childhood moving from log cabin to log cabin, which is where we got the name Lincoln Logs. It was at this point in his early childhood where some might say that Lincoln began to develop mommy issues. What do I mean by that? Well, if we flash forward to later in his life, Lincoln would refuse to visit his father's deathbed or even go to his funeral because he hated his father. He hated him. His father often abused him, treating him like a slave. A little bit of foreshadowing possibly. Abraham often described his father as a worthless, unintelligent brute who had no ambition in life. For this, he would cling to his mother's affection, who died when he was only at the age of 8 due to drinking infected milk. Gets the best of us. This is a loss that he would describe as the bitterest agony. Lincoln's father later remarried to a woman named Sarah Bush, who tacked on the family name to the end of hers, becoming Sarah Bush Lincoln. And Lincoln absolutely adored her. Much of his humor and his outgoing personality, along with his drive for knowledge, is credited to her. However, on the same note, thanks to Bad Spawn RNG, Lincoln's childhood was dominated by hard manual labor. His collar was blue and his neck was red. This was a sentence that he was desperate to escape, but obligated by law, he had to work for his father until the ripe age of 21, when he immediately left home to become what he would describe a piece of floating driftwood. Lincoln worked various other labor jobs, from splitting rails to ferrying passengers across rivers. It was through his trips ferrying passengers that he encountered his first ever slave auction. This was a key event for young Lincoln that helped to shape his later stances on slavery. Eventually, he wound up as a humble shopkeeper in New Salem, Illinois. And he settled down here for a while, finding love and losing love. On the outside, he became a local legend for his wit and storytelling, but behind the scenes, Lincoln was viciously studying and teaching himself law, politics, and history. These were all skills that would later shape him into the leader of the free world. It was during this time that Lincoln became a wrestler on the side, and over his 12-year career, he only ever had one recorded loss, which was to Hank Thompson. What a really stupid name that is. He actually became a local celebrity when he defeated Jack Armstrong. According to artist depictions, Lincoln bodied this man. But trouble was brewing when in 1832, Native Americans, under the leadership of tribal chief Black Hawk, tried to reclaim tribal homelands by force. The Indians are coming! The Indians are coming! The town volunteers who were seeking to defend their land elected Abraham Lincoln as their leader. Now, Lincoln did not see any hand-to-hand combat, but the experience was his first taste of leadership, of duty, and he would later describe their victory as one of the greatest experiences he ever had. Now, before we continue, it's important to mention Lincoln's melancholy, which had a lot to do with his struggles of pleasing the opposite sex. Many of you watching this probably have that issue. Lincoln was particularly awkward among women. "Springfield women avoid me," he would complain. This was majorly due to his frightening and awkward Chud appearance, which we will be getting into later as it pertains to how his campaign officials had to hide him from the public's eye. But for now, to put it simply, Abraham had a hard time meeting women, and when he found one, he had a much harder time keeping one. Lincoln's first love, Anna Rutledge, died at the age of 21. A few years later, Lincoln was engaged to a woman named Mary Owens. Upon engagement, she immediately began to put on weight, which Lincoln would go on to say that she reminded him of Shakespeare's obese character, Falstaff. But Mary too was unhappy. She claimed such things like that they would go out on horseback rides and Lincoln would never look back to see if my neck was broken. She later called off the marriage and said that he was defective when it came to a woman's happiness. Eventually, he met another young woman, also by the name of Mary, this time Mary Todd, and she would arguably destroy his entire life. Lincoln, doubting his ability at the time to support a wife, got cold feet and originally called off their wedding, which sent him into a raging depression. Back then, they called this melancholy or melancholia. Basically, it's just depression. It was so bad that all his close friends at the time believed that he was suicidal. They felt the need to remove all the knives and all the razors from his home. His depression left him bedbound. He starved himself and reportedly declared that he hated Mary. Lincoln was also said to, at one point, be in a delirious state of mind. With all that being said, Lincoln went on to drop an absolute banger of a quote. I must regain my confidence in my own ability to keep my resolves when they are made. In that ability, I once prided myself as the only, or at least the chief, gem of my character. That gem I lost. How and when? You too well know. I have not yet regained it, and until I do, I cannot trust myself in any matter of much importance. They ended up married anyways. Though he had earlier longed to end his commitment to Mary Todd, he now began to suspect that he loved her more than he had thought. How heartwarming. Lincoln quickly became what was called a battered husband back then. Mary was abusive both physically and verbally, which oftentimes led Lincoln to run away from his own home and wander the town, sometimes for an evening, sometimes overnight. If it wasn't bad enough, the entire town would overhear Mary screaming. Some report that she would bludgeon him in the face with various objects, or that she would throw scalding hot coffee in his face. Some believe this might be the origin story for when he thought up that one, a house divided amongst itself quote. Later, when the Lincolns moved into the White House, Lincoln would face controversy over Mary's outrageous spending. She became notorious for blasting loads of money on expensive clothing and jewelry. In 8 months, she had already overspent the White House decoration budget, and that was supposedly supposed to last 4 years. I must dress in costly materials. To keep up appearances, I must have money, more than Lincoln can spare for me. Mr. Lincoln is too honest to make a penny outside of his salary. Consequently, I have no alternative but to run him in debt. If he knew the extent, the knowledge would drive him wild. Mary overran the White House decoration budget by at least $20,000. Adjusted for inflation today, that would land just a little around $800,000. Just a little bit. Lincoln was outraged. He claimed that it was a stink in the nose to the suffering American people. He said that the White House was fine the way it was, and that he would have never approved 1 cent to refurbish the flub-dubs of this damned old house. Being Honorable Abe, he offered to pay it through his own salary. However, it was ultimately swept under the rug by his other officials. Later on, Mary never recovered from the trauma of witnessing her own husband's assassination, and she was institutionalized. But on a lighter note, slavery. Abraham Lincoln and the topic of slavery is a complex issue. Now remember, slavery was not the only issue for the war. There's a lot that was going on back then, but it was the most polarizing issue, the rallying point for the Union. The South often referred to Lincoln as the first black president, while the Union in the North met him with skepticism. While the Union in the North met him with skepticism. While the Union in the North was skeptical, and they faced him with dismay. In his early years, Lincoln was not a full-blown abolitionist yet. Now, yes, he was against slavery, but he recognized that this was an uphill battle, legally, morally, and nationally. He saw slavery as morally wrong, a sin, a failure of every idea America was founded on, and furthermore, he thought this was an economic strain. Yet he was troubled because at the time he believed the 10th Amendment protected slavery, and because of this he felt that there was no way to legally abolish it. This is one of the reasons why Lincoln had to really balance his stances on slavery. If he came out guns blazing on the issue, the North may have believed that he was overreaching and the Union would be lost. Now, Lincoln understood compromise. He knew that he couldn't get everything he wanted, but he still wanted to get something more than nothing. Lincoln originally believed in decolonization. He argued that if we were to free the slaves, then we should send them back, because blacks and whites should not coexist. Again, this was a popular sentiment back then in the 1840s, 1850s when he was in his political career. And because of this, after slavery, there was no real foundation for African Americans to gain rights or become equals or to have citizenship. So originally, he wanted them gone, shipped off, out of sight, out of mind, pack your bags, get all your crap, you're gone. This was considered sound and reasonable at the time. This was the middle ground. Several states in the Union were still slave states, but he had to walk a fine line in order to not lose support. I would hope to have God on my side, but without Kentucky, I would be lost. Lincoln's primary goal was to preserve the Union. He stated that if outlawing slavery would reach that conclusion, he would outlaw it. If keeping slavery would reach that conclusion, he would have no choice but to keep it. Many like to retroactively claim that Lincoln was a white supremacist due to his many letters that would get you canceled online today. But he was nothing like the men of his time. So how did Lincoln actually get to office, and how did he lead the nation through war and actually end the slavery? To answer that question, and for educational purposes, we will be discussing Lincoln's potential Chud and subhuman appearance, as they both positively and negatively impacted his entire political career and his ability to lead the nation. When you picture Lincoln, most people picture his top hat and his little beard, but most people don't realize that that famous beard was grown at the request of one little girl worried about Lincoln's ugly appearance. Lincoln was frightening. Lincoln was enormously tall at 6'4", which today that's like, you're short, you're a midget at that point. But back then, that was huge compared to their standards. He was described as extremely thin, shallow, sunk cheeks, and deep wrinkles on his asymmetrical face. He's also often described as lanky and clumsy, with very big hands and very big ears. All these traits put together, his opponents mocked him viciously, calling him ape-like, a rail splitter hick, a country bumpkin even. A rival once called him Two-Face, to which he would reply, "If I had another face, do you think I would wear this one?" And to make things harder, Lincoln had many awkward tendencies, like during speeches he would do this little thing where he bent his knees down a little, hopped up and threw his arms wide into the air. And lastly, his voice was exceptionally high-pitched and shrill. With everything put together, Lincoln was strange, and he was not what the public considered presidential. His campaign opted to keep his appearance from the public's eye when they could. Eventually, they leaned into his rough personality. With his rail splitter identity, Lincoln was then marketed as the real deal, a true cold-blooded frontiersman, and it worked. With everything I just mentioned originally working against Lincoln, when the public got past the shock of his face, they loved him. Prior to his presidency, he gave some of the most legendary and well-received speeches ever recorded in our history. He was even described as the greatest man since St. Peter. However, this was all, of course, in the eyes of the North, where the South despised him. They hated him. They wanted him dead. He received death threats every day. We will get into that shortly, but first I'm going to fill you in on his full political career before we continue. Going back a bit, in 1832, while Lincoln was in Illinois, he ran for state legislator, but lost. 2 years later, again, in 1834, he ran again, and this time he was elected to the Illinois state legislature. as a member of the Whig Party. So yes, Lincoln was a Whigger. He served 4 consecutive terms until 1842. He focused heavily on railroad development, banking systems, and the environment and canal systems, stuff like that, environmentalism. At the time, he was outspoken against slavery, but his efforts were more focused on stopping the spread rather than abolishing it. And he didn't really have the power to do that yet anyways. During this time, he also worked as a lawyer in the capital of Illinois, which is Springfield. So around this time, this is where the homosexuality question began. There's no evidence that Lincoln was actually gay. When he arrived at Springfield, Illinois for the first time, he was dirt poor and he could not afford his own place. Joshua Speed, who later became a very close friend to Lincoln, offered him a room, and reportedly it was a one-bed dwelling. Now today that seems like enough proof to seal a deal, but back then was different. Bed sharing was much more common, if not expected. Travelers, often strangers, shared beds together all the time. Hotels were expensive. Lincoln and Speed became very close. Obviously, they shared a bed. And when Joshua Speed eventually moved away, Lincoln was devastated. Lincoln wrote many emotionally charged letters to Speed, but none of them were ever romantic or suggested any type of sexual relationship. In 1843, he attempted to win the Whig Party nomination for Congress, but failed. In 1846, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he only served one term for 2 years, but in this time he mainly opposed the Mexican-American War, and he accused President Polk of misleading the nation into war, something that dissenters would later accuse him of. His abolition efforts gradually picked up at this time. He was mainly working against the westward expansion of slavery. For a few years, Lincoln worked only as a lawyer until he reached a turning point, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act pit the president and Lincoln. There was no turning back at this point. Before this act was introduced, we had the Missouri Compromise. For context, America was very young, and everything at this point was about westward expansion and building new territories, and thus new railroads. Basically, the greatest minds of the era got together and drew a line across America. They decided that everything south was a slave state and everything north was free. This was to keep an equal balance of the force, but in 1854, Stephen A. Douglas, a U.S. senator, schemed up a clever scheme, so clever that he would have even had the Pink Panther fooled. His new bill would make it so that all new territories would be able to vote on whether or not they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. This idea was called popular sovereignty. And at first this seems pretty reasonable, right? Pretty democratic. Let the people choose what they want. But the North was not happy. Not one bit. And Lincoln did not like it. For one, both Kansas and Nebraska were already clear above the dividing line and well in slave-free territory. Maybe Douglas thought that nobody would have noticed. But the North viewed this as not only an opening for slavery to prosper, but for the South to potentially gain overwhelming political power with their slave votes. And in turn, they would dictate policy for the entire nation at large. This brought Lincoln back to politics in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. And at the time, anti-slavery settlers and pro-slavery settlers were all rushing into Kansas to influence the vote for the act. And this became what is known as Sunday Bloody Kansas, a prequel to the Civil War. It's like a Black Friday at Walmart, but nobody was getting a good deal. Lincoln won the popular vote at 39%, with almost none of his votes coming from the South. So he kind of won by a landslide in the North. And faster than you can say Market Hot Dog is 35% off BOGO, America tore itself apart. Lincoln's primary dream was to keep the Union together, but before he was even inaugurated, South Carolina withdrew from the Union. And then on the day that he was inaugurated, another one fell. "Sir, a second state has withdrawn from the Union." Mississippi then went, making 2 states in total. But I lied, because it wasn't actually only 2 states in total. Not one, not two, but 6 states withdrew from the Union that same day. Together, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas pulled out. They were not having it. Across the South, federal forts and arsenals were being seized and rival governments were forming, while newspapers openly discussed the necessity for armed resistance. Lincoln was framed as a full-blown abolitionist tyrant, despite his insisting that he was not going to abolish slavery in territory where it already existed. So here is Lincoln's dilemma. How do you prevent a rising rebellion without looking like an aggressor? Lincoln was thrust into a problem, a situation he was not prepared for, and he quickly ran into a tiny little problem within the first couple weeks of his office. This tiny little problem was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, a little Union fort, resides in South Carolina and is essentially a little island. Unfortunately, Confederate rebels were closing in, and the Union soldiers, heavily unarmed, were sitting just like itty bitty little ducks. They were about to get touched in ways that they did not want to be touched. So Lincoln had two options. Does he reinforce the fort and appear as if he's prepping for war, or does he leave them open, coming off as weak? Lincoln decides to send them food instead of guns or ammunition. This was a move to force the Confederate soldiers to shoot the first shot. So now the dilemma was flipped back onto the Confederates. Do they let the food in and look like they're weak? Or do they attack the fort and become the aggressors? They chose the latter, officially starting the Civil War. As of the time of recording, this is not called Civil War I, and I hope it remains that way. Massive political rallies began in the North, and 4 more states seceded the Union. Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas were quick to fall. And very quickly it became apparent to Lincoln that he was surrounded by complete idiots. Anybody who works in fast food and lasts 3 months at a job understands this. The North dominated the South in economy, manpower, railway, and industry. But the South was much more clever in the beginning. They were more strategic. Lincoln's generals were arrogant, they were old, they were decrepit, slow, overly cautious, and this all led them to ultimately take no action. As a famous man once said, more is lost by indecision than by bad decision. And this was the philosophy that Lincoln wanted. One of his worst generals was George McClellan, who, although his army loved him, didn't do jack. He constantly ignored Lincoln's pressures and was overly paranoid, often dramatizing the situations, overplaying the enemy's power, such as saying things like the enemy has 150,000 soldiers when they actually have 80,000 soldiers. Now, day to day, thousands of men were dying, both in the Union and in the South, and this broke Lincoln. And with McClellan's inaction, it drove him insane. He already felt that each drop of blood, Union or Confederate, was on his hands, and he took the failure of his military personnel as a personal responsibility. All the while, many of his generals, especially McClellan, the idiot, would publicly disrespect him and treat him as if he was unexperienced and unfit to lead. As the war drew on, Lincoln studied military strategy obsessively, going weeks with barely sleeping at all. Every scuffle, every fight, every death or battle was to be reported to Lincoln at the end of day, every day. And this shaped him into the man that the country needed, but not the only man. Lincoln was saved when along came Ulysses S. Grant. His initials, USG, would later spell out his legendary title, Unconditional Surrender Grant. This was the man who made things happen. If you've been paying close attention, we have passed the prequels and we are currently in the New Hope movie. Coincidentally, Grant was the second ever person to hold the rank of Lieutenant General, the first and only other man being George Washington. This was thanks to Lincoln pushing Congress, and it was the right move. Grant fought relentlessly and was constantly on the move. He did not wait for the perfect, impossible battlefield conditions to arise. or for the stars to be aligned. He believed that the South would win an indefinite war, so he sought to end it quickly. And this pleased Lincoln. He really liked it. "I can't spare this man. He fights." Which was kind of like a bare minimum requirement for this position, but here we are. Despite his achievements, Grant faced a lot of crap. He was accused of being reckless, of being bloodthirsty, and many rumors went around that he was a drunk, and activists called for his removal. But Lincoln didn't care. "Found out what whiskey he drinks, and send a barrel to my other generals," he would joke. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant. He was throwing in the towel. It seemed like a happy ending, except something didn't feel right, and something was missing. Now, what I'm about to present to you might seem disturbing, and whether or not you believe it is fact or hyped up coincidence, you can decide for yourself, so I'm not going to tell you what to think. But there's theory that Lincoln had premonitions of his death leading up to his assassination. This is based on several different events collaborated by many witness testimonies, including obviously Lincoln himself. Early after his initial election to office, Lincoln was lounging in his Springfield home. Across the room there is a mirror, and when he glanced into the mirror, it appeared to have two faces. Lincoln claimed that one face looked normal, and the other was pale, ghostly, and slightly distorted. But when he got up to investigate, it disappeared. When he sat down, there it was again. Lincoln reportedly described this event as following: "I saw myself reflected nearly at full length in a glass, but my face had two separate and distinct images, the tip of the nose of one being 3 inches from the tip of the other. I was a little bothered, perhaps startled." Over the next few months, he tried replicating the exact conditions to see if he could bring back the odd reflection, trying all kinds of different angles, lighting the room differently, but he never saw it again. This disturbed his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. She claimed it was an omen, a bad omen. According to her, the normal face meant that he would live through one presidential term, and that the second ghostly face meant he would be elected again, but not live through it. And she wasn't wrong. Lincoln was in fact elected for a second term, but died about 6 weeks into it. Another bizarre event was when Lincoln dreamed of his own assassination. Now, some people say this happened weeks before he died. Other sources say a few weeks. Some people claim this happened 3 days before he died. The exact timing is unknown, and the sources kind of are all over the place. But in his dream, he was wandering through the empty halls of the White House, while all around him he heard crying and wallowing. And when he got into the East Room, a body lay there on display, surrounded by grieving citizens and guards. When he asked one of the guards who had died, the guard responded with, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Now, the one thing that the dream and his actual death have in common is in both the dream and real life, Lincoln's body was on display in the East Room. Whether or not these events were actually supernatural or it's just superstition, we don't know. Being the most hated man in the country, Lincoln had death threats through mail almost every day. Everywhere he went, his life was at risk, and multiple attempts had already been made on his life. One time he was riding through the night on the horseback, and a bullet went right through his hat. So going back to earlier when we talked about Lincoln's melancholy, Lincoln was very reflective upon his own mortality. He knew the risk his position brought him, and at times those close to Lincoln were often given the impression that Lincoln was waiting to die, that he was expecting it to happen. The burden of impending doom is enough to fill anyone with paranoia, and his presidency was restless, depressing, and a never-ending worry. All of this could have been what spurred on these supernatural-like events, these dreams. And the sad thing is, all of this pain that Lincoln carried could have gone away. If only he had the time. By April 1865, the war was almost over. It was ending, but not fast enough for Lincoln to see it. Lincoln awoke on his last day alive in an unusually happy mood. As I mentioned earlier, General Lee had surrendered, and the war was coming to a close. At this stage, Union victory was all but assured. Lincoln spent the morning with his cabinet officials discussing strategy on how to unite the post-war nation. Later in the evening, he went on a horse carriage ride with his wife, Mary, who described him as so joyful he was almost boyish. His optimism was renewed, and his eyes were set on the future of the nation and the peace that his family would finally achieve. And although he did not want to go, out of fear of disappointing the public, Lincoln would set out one last time to Ford Theater. When he left the White House for the final time, instead of telling his bodyguard good night, as he always did, he reportedly said goodbye. Sources, trust me, bro. His arrival at Ford Theater, along with the appearance of General Grant, was foretold in the marketing for the play Our American Cousin. And in a move that may have altered history, General Grant and his wife decided last minute to not attend the showing, leaving Lincoln and Mary as the only star guest appearances. As to why the Grants did not show is still debated. However, some attribute the fact that both General Grant and his wife did not like Mary. Nearby, John Wilkes Booth was plotting his assassination. He arranged a getaway horse and made highly advanced modifications to Lincoln's box. Some of these highly advanced modifications included drilling a spy hole into the door and staging a wooden post that would later be used to lodge the door in the hallway leading to Lincoln's box. 150 years later, this amount of effort and foresight put into presidential assassination has remained unmatched. Shortly before Booth entered the theater that night, he stopped at a place across the street to grab a whiskey. This was a place called the Star Saloon. But Booth would not be alone that night. In the same bar, possibly sitting right across from him, was a police officer from D.C. named John Frederick Parker. Parker was the bodyguard who was assigned to watch the door to Lincoln's box, the door that was unguarded when Booth came through. It's possible that these two men exchanged greetings. Booth was a famous and well-known actor. To see him in a bar would be like stumbling across Chris Evans in a Walmart. Even Lincoln was a huge fan of Booth, along with Lincoln's son. Lincoln actually invited Booth to the White House on several occasions, but the Confederate actor turned down all of these invitations, and we soon find out why. Not too long later, Booth enters Ford Theater, making his way through the backstage and descending into the cellar, and creeping his way through the theater, up some stairs, and right into the presence of the 16th sitting president. Now he was waiting for the killing joke. In the third and final act of the play, there was a joke, a punchline, that was really funny back then but probably makes no sense today. Booth was waiting for this moment. He knew that the crowd would erupt into laughter that would silence his gunshot like a silencer.
They say I don't know the minute of what's time. I guess I know enough to turn that old gal inside out.
And bam, Lincoln's head falls forward. Lincoln, the tortured man, was dead, and an ocean of laughter from those that he gave his life for. Now, of course, the crowd did not realize anything had happened yet, but those in Lincoln's box did. Lincoln's special guest, Army Major Henry Rathbone, is quick to lunge at Booth. But Booth plunges his knife deep into Henry's arm, down to the bone, and jumps off the stage to get away. But on his way down, his leg catches on the American flag, twisting him midair, causing him to slam into the stage, breaking his leg. America! Now you may think this was the end of John Wilkes Booth. He was laying there, face first on the stage with a broken leg, with the entire audience looking at him, while the president lay dead in the box above. But he gets up, and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always the tyrants." Booth makes his getaway, hobbling away, while Lincoln is rushed into a nearby home for medical care. So Lincoln is in a coma, but obviously the next morning he dies. Booth fled down south, but 14 days later, after the largest manhunt in American history, Union soldiers surround a barn where he is suspected to be. Booth tries to fight his way out, but is shot dead. Now, following Lincoln's death, the nation mourned like never before. His body was placed into a funeral train that took him from Washington back to his home in Springfield. And symbolically almost, the train followed a very similar path to the one that he took when he traveled to Washington for his inauguration. On the way, his body crossed through several states and hundreds of cities. It is estimated that millions of people gathered to mourn him. Businesses shut down and churches were packed. In death, Lincoln again united the country. And when you reflect on today, we probably haven't seen unity like that ever since. I made this video because there was so much to President Lincoln that I never knew, that my schools never taught me, and I feel like many other people have never even heard half of this stuff. So it kind of sucks because he had a crazy life. And I know that present day people like to focus heavily on judging his character and come up with all kinds of labels and opinions. A lot of people like to just write him off as a racist or a white supremacist. Others claim that he waged the war just to politically crush the South and expand government control. I think that if you get so stuck up and only see the negatives of the past, you can never really change the future. At the time that I made this video, it's June of 2026, and I know a lot of young men are depressed and feel hopeless. I'm becoming one of them. Look at his life and realize you could have it much worse. And yet with much worse, Lincoln did much more than most men can ever dream to achieve. Love him or hate him, Abraham Lincoln is proof that anyone can be born to nothing, and through relentless study and self-discipline, become a name that history will never ever forget.